Welcome to Mountain Strong. Today we are at the Carr-Gottstein Park, which I admit when I drove up to it I didn't have very high expectations of. I saw it on the map and I was kind of hoping that I would be able to get through this park down to the dramatic coastline that surrounds the city of Anchorage, and sure enough it actually did that, and I'm very thankful for that. This is a really beautiful day. We sometimes get days in Anchorage that are overcast, but then every now and then we get one of these beautiful blue sunny days. Today we're going to be having a look at the 8th Psalm, and so let's go ahead and dive right into that. Psalm 8, verse 1. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens. Out of the mouth of babies and infants you have established strength because of your foes, to still the enemy and the avenger. When I look at the heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the son of man that you care for him? Yet you have made him a little lower than the heavenly beings, and crowned him with glory and honor. You have given him dominion over the work of your hands. You have put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, and also the beasts of the field, the birds of the heavens, the fish of the sea, whatever passes along the paths of the seas. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. Immediately in getting into this psalm, I want to point out something that you're going to see occasionally in the Psalms. Did you notice how the first and the last verse began exactly the same? In terms of kind of poetical elements, that's something called an inclusio. And what an inclusio does is it sort of encapsulates the thought of whatever the work of poetry is trying to set forth. In the case of the Psalms, an inclusio encapsulates the idea of the psalm. What's the psalm trying to set forth? What's the psalm trying to teach us about? In the beginning and the end of this psalm, you see this instruction to us. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. And so we can expect in this psalm to see something that sets forth the majesty of the Lord, or something that would prompt this kind of statement of praise to the Lord. Well, what is it exactly? As you're reading through this psalm, what you're actually seeing is praise for the Lord because of the position of humanity. I don't know about you, but when I hear people discuss humanity, it's usually in a negative sense. You know, I don't know if you've heard that saying of Alexander Pope before, to err is human, to forgive divine. And so built into that saying is something that we kind of take for granted, that being human is to err. It's a part of our condition. It's a part of who we are. We make mistakes. Another one of my favorite sayings, because of the original version of it, and also because of the way it's come into common vernacular: the best laid schemes of mice and men gang after gley. That was Robert Burns who said that, and the popularized version of that is the best laid plans of mice and men often go astray, which is what I guess gang after gley means. But the idea is that humans, the best that they can do, the utmost that they can do in planning, are they basically equate to mice, and their plans often go astray. Either way you look at those quotes, you're seeing humanity portrayed as flawed, as not perfect, not even good from Alexander Pope's point of view, to err as human. But as you think about those statements and you think about the way that humanity is perceived, how does it square with what you're seeing here in this psalm? Can you see something different? Now, the psalmist is aware of the relative unworth he has to the position in which God has placed him. But I want you to see what the psalmist realizes about the position of humanity, and see what it teaches you and what it teaches me about what it is to be human. Okay, let's go into verse 2. It says here that out of the mouths of babies and infants you have established strength because of your foes, to still the enemy and the avenger. Now, that doesn't seem to have a lot to do with the rest of the psalm until you realize the purpose it serves for the rest of the psalm. What is that teaching you? It's teaching you that God is able to use that which is relatively weak or insignificant, babies and infants. He's able to use babies and infants to defeat his foes or his enemies. God can use that which is weak and do amazing and wonderful things with that which is insignificant or weak. And so as God can do with babies, so he does with humanity. He takes that which is seemingly insignificant, seemingly weak, and he enables it to do great things. As he moves into the thought, therefore, of verse 3, when I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him? Even though the psalmist is well aware of the way that God works, he is still truly humbled by the position that God has placed man in. Think about the sun, the moon, the stars. Think about the beautiful things all around us that we are able to see. All of these wonderful things that God has made. And what is my position in all of this? You see, the psalmist is aware of something that I think is kind of necessary information for going into the psalm. He's aware of, I believe, Genesis chapter 1 and verse 28. You remember God's instruction to humanity on that occasion? He said there that man was to subdue the earth and have dominion over the earth. And I think that this is the psalmist's reflection on that psalm. The earth is so majestic and mighty. How could man have this position of honor? And yet he does. God must see something in man, some potential in man for true greatness. He says in verse 5, you have made him a little lower than the heavenly beings and crowned him with glory and honor. It's interesting that the straight line translation of that, you have made him a little lower than the heavenly beings, is actually you have made him a little lower than God. The translations of the Bible that came after the Old Testament oftentimes, instead of writing the word God, use the word angels. In Hebrews chapter 2, which I believe is quoting one of the old versions of the Bible, the Greek Old Testament. When it's quoting the Greek Old Testament, follows that tradition, and so in Hebrews chapter 2, we've been made a little lower than angels. As you reflect upon that, though, as we think about ourselves in both lights, we are made a little lower than God in the sense that we were made in the image of God, as it says in Genesis chapter 1, and we are made a little lower than the angels. They have a wonderful position in the throne room of God and in the heavens. But at the same time, as it relates to us and them, in the book of Revelation, you remember as well as I do probably, that when John tried to bow down and worship the angels, remember what the angel said back to him? He said, no, you can't do this. I'm just a servant like you. The same way that Peter rejected worship in Acts chapter 10 is the same way that the angel rejected worship when John tried to do it. Angels are not worthy of worship. They are servants of God. And if Hebrews 1 is to be taken into the picture, they are also servants of us. They are ministers of those who are the heirs of salvation. And so God made man into a mighty position. He crowned him with glory and honor. He gave him dominion over the works of his hands, it says in verse 6. He has put all things under his feet, all sheep, oxen, beasts of the field, birds of the heavens, fish of the sea, whatever passes through the paths of the sea. We have a truly wonderful and blessed position as human beings. Now, before I reflect a little bit more on that, I want to say something just as a bit of a side note. If you are reading along with me and you notice that phrase in verse 8, the paths of the sea, I encourage you to go online and to do a little bit of a search for Matthew Fontaine Murray. If you've never heard about that before, that's a very interesting story. Matthew Fontaine Murray was sick, and he had this psalm read to him, and as a consequence of reading this psalm, he set out to find the paths of the sea, which he indeed did find. There are paths that actually move through the oceans and help to circulate the water and keep it from stagnating in addition to the tides. And so that's a really interesting story, a story of one man taking the Bible to heart, a story of scientific foreknowledge in the Bible, and so on. But that's a side point. So in reflecting on this psalm before we leave our study for today, I don't think, I'm not always going to go into the New Testament rather, to examine the New Testament point of view on the Old Testament Psalms, but I think on this psalm you just have to. And I want you to go with me now to the book of Hebrews, and you'll have to bear with me as I try to turn the pages here with these big gloves. Hebrews chapter 2. And we're going to go to that occasion where this psalm is quoted. Hebrews chapter 2. And wouldn't you know it, they've put the reading that I'm going to use on 2 pages just to make sure that I can use these gloves well. But anyway, Hebrews chapter 2, and let's look at verse 6 because this is where it's quoted. It has been testified somewhere, what is man that you are mindful of him, or the son of man that you care for him? You made him for a little while lower than the angels. You have crowned him with glory and honor, putting everything in subjection under his feet. Now, in putting everything in subjection to him, he left nothing outside his control. At present, we do not see everything in subjection to him, but we see him who for a little while was made lower than the angels, namely Jesus, crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering and death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for every one. New Testament audiences are tempted when they read this psalm to assume, when they read in Hebrews chapter 2 the quotation of this psalm, they are tempted to look at Psalm 8 and say, well, that's about Jesus. And I want you to realize that that's not true. It is about Jesus in a way, because Jesus, as we're going to find out later in the reading of this chapter, Jesus is man. But that is a psalm about man. It's the psalmist's reflection on the beautiful and wonderful position that God has placed man in. What's the point that the Hebrews author is making? The point is that man is supposed to have everything under subjection. He's supposed to be in control of everything that's in this earth. But there's one thing that's not in subjection to man, even to this day. Death is not in subjection to man. Death, that great enemy that we've talked about in previous studies, that great enemy that we are to hate and even are allowed to have an emotional response to as Christians, even though we know that we will depart and go to a better place, death is not finished yet. Christ became the first fruits of the resurrected one, but for the rest of us, until he returns, we go down into the earth, and that's it for us until, of course, he returns. And so death has not yet been put into subjection. But, the Hebrews author says, Jesus came, and he put death into subjection. And so what's the beautiful picture then, therefore? That Jesus became man and did what man was meant to do. He overcame all things, including death. Jesus did for man what man could not do for himself. But what does it say about Jesus that he was willing to do that? And what does it say about Jesus that he was able to do that? If you keep reading on in this chapter, you find that Jesus, it says in verse 14, was a partaker of the same things as us, flesh and blood. Flesh and blood. He was subject to the same limitations. He had the same potentials. He had the same temptations as us. Flesh and blood. And it says then at the close of this chapter, in verse 17, therefore he had to be made like his brothers in every respect. When you read Psalm 8 in the future, I want you to allow yourself to have a higher regard for humanity than we often have. Now, are we worthy of that regard? Are we worthy of this wonderful position that God has placed us in? Of course not. In fact, you know how wonderful it is, how majestic is the Lord's name in all of the earth, because he's made this earth and because he's put us over it. So we don't view ourselves as being worthy of our position, but we need to view ourselves as being in a wonderful position, and we need to, when we look at Jesus, not see a perfect standard to which we can never attain, but to see a fellow man who showed us our potential, and to strive to reach that potential in ourselves. May God bless you.